there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?"
David Foster Wallace begins his now famous commencement speech with this wonderful illustration suggesting that if we could talk to fish, we might discover that fish have never given a moment's thought to water. They live in it, they eat in it, they sleep in it, they reproduce and die in it, but something that is entirely pervasive in our environment rarely becomes something that we are conscious of, something that we think about. And racism is like that. If white privilege and patriarchy is the water that you are born into, the water you live in, go to school in, work in, it's quite likely that you are blissfully unaware of either white privilege or patriarchy. You might argue that persons of color have always known a lot about racism and women have always known a lot about patriarchy. But I can tell you, I was at, Ashley and I were at a meeting at Harmony House last night in which evangelicals were decrying domestic violence while reiterating the religion that is homophobic and misogynistic, that creates violence within families, and they're not even aware that their religion has produced the toxic families that they're trying to survive. It is entirely possible for even persons of color and women to be blissfully unaware of how racism and patriarchy has affected them until it is brought up, until they see what they've been swimming in every minute of their lives. When my good friends Scott and Nicole Fisk went to see the movie Hidden Figures, which is a movie about three black women whose math skills led to the first successful space launch and, of course, the first successful manned space launch, Scott looked at Nicole and demanded to know, why haven't I heard about this before? And for those of us who lived through that time in history, the point is rather more pronounced. Because a story about advanced math skills of black women was counter to the cultural narrative in which white people assumed the inferiority of both blacks and women. So even though it was an incredibly important part of our scientific history in America, it never showed up in textbooks. It never showed up in newspapers because it would have confronted our racism and our patriarchy. And just as a sidebar, I want to just add this observation. You don't have to put anything extra in the collection plate for this. This paragraph is totally free. Every time that you have heard the media referred to as the liberal media or schools as having the accusation of having a liberal bias, let me just go on the record right now calling BS on that propaganda. The media and school books are on the same white, male, pro-corporate, pro-war bandwagon, and any exception to that prejudice is rare and it's usually accidental, and you find it being corrected almost right away. Patriarchy and racism are the water we swim in.
Amen.
Thank you. I thought somebody must be listening. A few months ago, David observed in our Sunday morning class that all the books that we had read together over the past year and a half had been authored by white people. Now, that was not a conscious decision made on our part. It's just the way things worked out. You don't have to think about it. It's just the books that were coming to our attention that we were discussing reading together were written by white people. Chris Krass writes in his wonderful collection of essays, Towards Collective Liberation, that this is how white supremacy works. Whiteness is universalized as the norm of just what is. It doesn't require a conscious decision to have thoughts that are racist, because it is racism that shapes the structure of our thoughts. White supremacy is the tide that directs the flow of our thoughts. It doesn't require us to go out of our way to be racist. It requires that we just follow the flow of the dominant ideology. Now, you don't have to choose to be a racist. The cultural myth, especially in America, is that everything of interest throughout history has been done by white Westerners. You would assume that all great explorers were white unless you looked at who was helping them to get those dog sleds up to the North Pole and who helped to navigate across the seas. You would assume that all inventors, statesmen, and philosophers were all white. Even within the church, we have assumed that great theologians are white, except that the most famous of them were black. St. Augustine, do you really know who he was? We presume that the world is essentially a white culture that's only been seasoned by the diversity of people of color. The great American land of opportunity suggests that poor Northern European settlers forged a great nation out of North America and made themselves wealthy and powerful. But folks, you know, the truth is, American wealth depended entirely on the genocide of tens of millions of Native Americans who had already developed farmland and roads and structures that we simply took after we killed them. And then we processed all of that farmland and a lot of the construction on the strength of uncompensated labor from black African slaves. Now, if you'll indulge me, a bit longer quote from Chris Crass's book. The United States was created by the wealthy class to maximize private power and wealth through exploitation of the vast majority's labor and oppression of the vast majority's humanity. Wealth and power have been and are taken from the majority through slavery, genocide, colonization, indentured servitude, and low-paying, high-profit-making jobs, and unpaid reproductive labor in homes and the community. Racism enables economic exploitation that drives down wages, drives up the cost of living, health care, education, and the basic needs that more and more people are finding themselves unable to meet. Racism erodes safety and health for the people of color it targets, and then it works on the rest of us. Racism causes environmental crises that impact communities of color first and worst, and are changing life as we know it for all of us. End quote. You don't have to keep that up. Segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods, segregated churches have served the interest of keeping minorities and the exploited poor from ever forming bonds that would allow them to organize and to resist this economic and cultural exploitation. Amen. Even after integration, please note the repeated prejudice lessons about interracial dating and marriage. Note the systematic removal of black men from neighborhoods and families through incarceration, through unemployment, that has kept black families locked into repeated cycles of multi-generational poverty. Black people have always known about police brutality and excessive policing in black communities, but it wasn't until we saw the grainy video of the arrest and beating of Rodney King in 1991 that many white people got their first exposure to the fact of police brutality. 4 police officers who were clearly videoed using excessive force and actually assaulting King were put on trial, and all 4 were acquitted, sparking a riot in 1992 that resulted in the deaths of 63 people, and more than 2,000 more were injured. The riots continued until the governor sent the National Guard to restore order. And over all of the violence and chaos, Rodney King was heard plaintively asking, "Why can't we all just get along?" Which is a good question, but part of the answer is because things don't seem to change much. The 4 officers charged with brutality against King were acquitted in 1992, which you would think would begin to change things, but in almost every high-profile case of subsequent beatings, shootings, and wrongful deaths, the police are virtually never found guilty of a crime. 6 Baltimore police were involved in the killing of Freddie Gray. 3 of them were acquitted, and charges were dropped against the other 3. Sandra Bland died in a Texas jail. The arresting officers and the jailers that were involved in her death, all charges were dropped. Samuel Du Bois, killed in Cincinnati, resulted in 2 mistrials, and then the charges were dropped. Philando Castillo, killed in Minnesota, charges against the officer were dropped. And of course, in Missouri's own high-profile case, the officer who shot the unarmed teen, Michael Brown, was ruled to have acted in self-defense, even though Michael Brown was unarmed and was standing more than 30 feet away from the officer. Why can't we all get along? Maybe because the end of African slavery just was turned into mass incarceration, prison labor, impoverished schools, and unemployment. Maybe because desegregation of the schools just became economic segregation in neighborhoods and towns. And maybe because equal treatment under the law has never actually happened. Racism is so much the water we swim in that it's been difficult for us to be aware of how bad it has been. We begin to take some steps in the right direction, and then we take a step back, and sometimes several steps back. I grew up in a church that had a balcony. The little Plaza Theater, just a block off the square in Glasgow, Kentucky, had a balcony. And the balcony at church and the balcony in the theater were so that black people could at least attend church and attend the same movies that their white neighbors went to. But when the civil rights movement started, the balconies were closed. Rather than making progress and tearing down the balconies so that we all sat together, both venues became restricted to black folks. There was a backlash, just as it became unheard of for whites and blacks to go to school together or to date or to marry. Martin Luther King Jr. called the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America. He said that 50 years ago. How different is it now? We elected the first black president in 2008, and 8 years later, we elected the most openly racist president in living memory. Where police violence against black people was nearly invisible to white folks 30 years ago, the advent of video cameras and smartphones has given us irrefutable evidence that we were wrong all along. But the court system still acts like it can't see the evidence that is right in front of their lying eyes. A half a century ago, President Lyndon Johnson said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you." The ruling wealthy elites have tried to keep poor whites and minorities and the working class from ever organizing, from ever getting together enough to be able to work together. And the strongest bonds in life are family and marriage. And you see the resistance to interracial dating and marriage even today. I guarantee you, a black and white person in a car driving around MSU's campus is still a dozen times more likely to be pulled over for no reason other than that there's a black person and a white person riding in a car together. Interracial dating is still being repressed by the police in our city. They feed prejudice in order to keep us weak. Do you think that we have made some great strides in the anti-racist evolution of our country? And I would say yes, but progress has been not just slow, progress has been too slow. And we are nowhere near where we should be in 2018. But we cannot be defeated by the fact that we have not yet landed in the land of freedom and equality, because it isn't going to come to us on its own 2 feet. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk." If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, keep moving. It falls on us to convince our generation that Black lives matter, that inequality in our court system, inadequacy in our schools, discrimination in hiring, promotions, even awards in movies and the music industry, when there's prejudice in those decisions, all of us are impoverished. There wouldn't be an America if there had not been Black units and Native American soldiers during the Revolutionary War. I don't know if you know it, but America would have starved to death during World War II had we not asked the Mexican government to import 2 million laborers to come and work the farms and the agricultural industry in the United States when we sent all of our soldiers abroad and most of our women were working in the manufacture of military hardware. Without the importation of Mexican labor, America would have starved to death. Our racial diversity is not our problem. Our racial diversity is our strength, our resource for having become the most inventive and industrious nation in the world. The only reason that there's still so much poverty, incarceration, unemployment, and such poor education among minority groups is because of the racist environment that has taught us not to notice it and to passively accept it as a permanent fixture in society. Amen. The day has come when relying upon the ignorance of the masses will no longer work. We can't fly, and most days it doesn't seem like we can run. And some days even walking seems hard, but we damn well better crawl. We must speak up. We must educate. We must organize. And then we will learn to fly.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.